Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about X-Men Dark Phoenix. So, this is not the worst X-Men movie, but it is also not like a good movie. And I think that calls to mind what sort of the X-Men franchise is. Now, I don't think it is entirely just like a total shitbag and nothing is good in it, because I've never really thought about this franchise. It was a franchise that I really loved because of my love for the X-Men. And growing up with X-Men comics, I was so excited for this franchise right from when I first heard it was going to happen. I may have, and I think we all who were around then, overloved certain movies just because this was our first taste at a comic book movie. But it's not how a comic book movie would be refined, specifically a Marvel Comics movie. Now, you'd have both of the major DC superheroes, or the two top ones, I guess, Batman and Superman, had movies before this, obviously. But no Marvel movie had really been made. That was really a unique thing, despite Marvel being like the comic book company I really grew up on and was the big comic company throughout the 90s. DC still had stuff going on, but like, let's be real here. Blade certainly started some things, but X-Men was like a major franchise that we all read, that we were all obsessed with, that got an animated series, but we never thought would become a movie. And that's what it did. And that was great. But in terms of how it writes these films, Dark Phoenix is kind of all the problems with that early idea of doing a comic book movie. Then it shows and highlights how that works for it. And I think in some ways this franchise, and certainly with Logan or Deadpool, understood that this went in much more of a character direction, and that's the better way to do it. The X-Men team films, I guess, or whatever, don't do that. And it's a shame because they stay very strict to what an X-Men movie is. And I think that's kind of the biggest problem with that. You know, it isn't as bad as their last time they did a Dark Phoenix movie. Sure. It is a lot better than like one of the worst comic book movies ever made, and absolutely the worst X-Men movie, which honestly there's competition because X-Men Origins Wolverine was really awful and X-Men The Last Stand is awful, so pick whichever. And then you have Apocalypse, and I'm sure I'm forgetting something else that was real bad. It's certainly like better, but it's not going beyond that. I mean, Dark Phoenix is a story, shouldn't be told this way. It shouldn't be told in one movie. It's a series of movies thing. It's frankly something that went over like 40 issues or something like that. You really have to build it and go through various characters and villains and build with the Phoenix and Jean Grey and that character. This probably would have been a lot better if it was more about the character of Jean Grey than like all these different things, like having the villain that Jessica Chastain plays, which is not the White Queen, which is like truly disappointing because what they picked was basically the aliens in the planet that Phoenix destroys in the original comics. Not really a spoiler there. And in this, they're like trying to control the Phoenix power, all this stuff. It's almost like the writers want to prove to you, like, hey guys, I do know who Chris Claremont is, and I read a couple of these issues. And at the time when they first started doing it, it was amazing because you're like, oh my god, they're referencing this thing, and I know this thing, and I'm so excited. And now it's just like, but why did you do that? And their answer is like, but we did it, right? And you did a deep cut, but it's sort of like one of those things where like, I mean, that's cool, but like I would have actually preferred, and everyone's a story, I just liked if you did like the actual thing, like not this nonsense that you always do. It can't do Days of Future Past like the comic. It has to be, well, what if we overly complicate it? And go, well, what if you like didn't do that? Unlike like what Marvel does, Marvel Studios, which this is still not Marvel Studios, it's just, well, it sort of is, but more of a licensing thing and not a movie that they actually produced. They bought the license or whatever. They have like so little involvement. Like Kevin Feige like looked at the script and went, I'm not going to read this. Like, this would have been so interesting if it was just about Jean, from Jean's perspective. And even if this is necessarily flawed and like not well written and the tone is kind of like, man, it like doesn't really highlight the characters and it doesn't really have enough fun in it, and there's other problems. If it had just stayed within the Jean character and like her battle within had been a character piece where the character is both the protagonist and the antagonist, and kind of having to choose between the two would have been insanely interesting. I would have been like, hey, this isn't the Dark Phoenix movie I've always wanted, but it's like interesting. That's sort of the thing with these things. Like, they don't really know why they're doing something, they're just sort of doing it, and that's not as interesting to watch as a viewer, especially when the film isn't really playing up those things or isn't examining those things for a specific reason. It just looks like they just never sort of went to it. There is a certain laziness to the writing in this, in that, like, one, it feels like we've sort of way evolved past this. Like, it felt like the X-Men films understood this franchise, that Days of Future Past was trying to be the continuity heavy X-Men film, and it was trying to kind of acknowledge that the MCU had happened, and continuity in comic book movies was something, especially with Marvel movies, should definitely be explored. And then you get to Apocalypse and it feels like they've kind of forgotten all that and remade Last Stand for some reason, and then we're continuing on that. It felt like this franchise was sort of understanding how to evolve itself, and then it sort of just went, yeah, but what if we like went back to how comic book movies used to be? And I'm just kind of sitting there wondering, like, but did anyone want that? And what is your reason for doing that? And I feel like in terms of a theoretical reason for these films, the theory ended at Days of Future Past, and we've just kind of been stuck in this stasis while Deadpool and Logan get to take that on and do something interesting with it. And that is extremely disappointing. I'm surprised this cast and everyone thought they should continue this. This Simon Kinberg, who has been very involved in all the X-Men films, even was directing portions of Apocalypse and some portions of Days of Future Past. When you look at this one, it just feels like more of the same, but like better than last time, but not better enough that you're like, oh man, those X-Men movies were pretty cool. These were essential for the time, but don't really work anymore. And in terms of like someone who knows film history and can like talk about a film within its context, it feels like this film's context ended a while ago. And even when First Class happened, it had ended a while ago. But you kind of thought, well, maybe it'll find a way to get this to work, and we'll see where the genre's going. And then you get to Days of Future Past and go, oh, this has evolved. And then it just like sort of stops. That stoppage has put it in this weird, like, we're just making sequels because we need to make sequels kind of thing. And it feels really uninspired at this point. It feels like they just set in stone, this is how you make a comic book movie, and the genre and the audiences and the way this genre has evolved, the X-Men have kind of just stayed behind for no real reason. And when X2, that sort of works for it because there's enough entertaining bits to it. I think one of the good things about that is, you know, maybe it's not the greatest adaptation of God Loves, Man Kills or something. It works within, like, there's a reason they adapted it and changed it within the kind of structure of those sort of films. The reason they changed Dark Phoenix is just like, I really don't know. Same with Apocalypse. There's not like a real reason for it, and they don't have the entertaining bits to it. Like, there's only one real part where they show off the powers, which is the end train sequence, which I sort of did like, to be honest, but the rest of it, it just felt like we're going, you know, kind of examining where the world is. It feels like the season premiere of a long-running show where like the first episode is mainly to just be like, oh, this is where this guy's at now and stuff, but it didn't seem to like know what they're doing with it. Like the idea of Magneto and Genosha and Magneto's context being changed and the government sort of giving him this island for some reason. The view of mutants just felt very rushed and gone through. The view of Jean Grey, it felt like a character who we didn't really know, and like, why did she become Phoenix back in like Apocalypse for some reason? Like the whole idea of Storm and Cyclops, and clearly like Storm's becoming more of a leader, was sort of wasted. There's a lot of dynamic changes. There's no cool Quicksilver sequence, which to be honest, it felt a little lame last time they did it, because it's like, it felt like they're just like redoing the same bit. But like, I kind of was like, well, there'll be a cool Quicksilver bit, I have that going for me. And then it like didn't happen. He was like out for most of the movie for no reason, and the whole idea of anyone dying meant nothing because we know this is the last X-Men movie, and it's like you could literally kill everybody. It like fucking doesn't matter anymore. And it's kind of a sad way to end the X-Men, this franchise, because the X-Men are an amazing property. Especially nowadays, we really need a good X-Men movie. These films kind of don't want to do that. They don't want to be this insanely entertaining thing. And certainly even X2, as thrilling and as amazing as Bryan Singer got that to work then, I don't think any of these other than like First Class, no one else has really been able to do that as well. Hell, even Bryan Singer's other attempts didn't really work. It was always trying to mask, in a lot of ways, that they just simply were adapting comics in a very kind of strange way, where they're like referencing things, and they're always about superpowers, and they're always trying to, whether someone has mutant powers or someone's going to be given mutant powers or going to take away someone's mutant powers. I think what worked about X2 is it did all that, and it kind of acknowledged the kind of hatred and bigotry and so forth that the X-Men and mutants faced, and how that was being manipulated and so forth. But in Dark Phoenix, it's like it comes up and changes at a whim, and sure, certainly it does feel like people will like turn to racism pretty quickly. It doesn't really get into kind of the social nuances of that. It's kind of a mess in terms of trying to do all those things. And I think that's really unfortunate, kind of the legacy that these films kind of represent, because as much as I like X-Men 2 and Logan, and I know other people like those Deadpool movies a lot and stuff, other than like starting off this thing and proving that there's a box office success and this actually can work, I don't know if this franchise really proved much more than that. As someone who really loves the X-Men and would like for there to be a much better franchise of X-Men movies at a certain point, feels like this franchise has worn out its welcome, worn out its even usefulness to this genre. It's not operating in any way that's going to help this genre progress. It's kind of almost holding it back by trying to be this whole like old guard way of doing things, but not really having a reason for it. So it's like kind of a typical old guard thing where they're just trapped in this idea of doing what both the studio wants and what they feel that this thing should be without any reason anymore. Days of Future Past was so smart at doing that, but when you get to Dark Phoenix, it's like, well, why are we doing Dark Phoenix again? Like, what about the 90s says something about Dark Phoenix? What about this character? Like, maybe we should meet Jean Grey a little bit more before, like, doing this whole thing. Maybe, have the Hellfire Club involved. Maybe this should be a trilogy at the least, and not just one movie. It's not a story that can be told in one movie. And I think, the additional failure of this film highlights that. Sure, it is maybe a better one, and Apocalypse was way worse, but it just kind of shows you that this kind of idea of adapting something and changing it for very little to no reason and adding in villains just because you need to have villains to it doesn't really work as well. I think with Logan, it works because it's like a road film and it's more about those things. But in this, it just feels like you're kind of bringing in this all evil, but you don't really understand thematically what you're doing with that. The X-Men film should mean more than that. And, having all these great actors attached to this franchise, you wish they could really sink their teeth into what this material can really do. But that's been gone for a long time. This is so disappointing way to end, but it's sort of a typically disappointing way to end. Dark Phoenix very much feels like an X-Men movie. It's written like an X-Men movie. It's almost like adhering to the genre of itself, but it kind of just makes me go like, yeah, but I don't really like this genre anymore. I'm sad to see this franchise go because it did mean something to me, but I think as someone who's seen all of these movies, I kind of just want it to be over. I wanted it to be over. I want it to change. I want it to become something more interesting. And doing the Dark Phoenix again and not having a Hugh Jackman cameo or a Deadpool cameo or anything that's going to make me want to really talk about it, because I was thinking most times when I see a movie I'll be like, oh yeah, this movie did have that thing, but with Dark Phoenix I'm like, oh, I saw the X-Men movie because I like X-Men, and that's it. If you were talking to your friend, what would you tell them about this big blockbuster movie that's supposed to be a populist thing that people can talk about? There isn't anything. And the best that X-Men Dark Phoenix has is, hey, what if Phoenix, but better, but not good? Kind of shows you this, creatively it is petered out at this point. And there's no real reason to keep going back to this. I really don't want to see Dark Phoenix again in a movie, unless they've told a lot of other stories and it's a series of films. Because this is just so fucking obnoxious at this point. It's you're just kind of fucking with me. And that arc really meant a lot to me. And Days of Future Past, it wasn't exactly the comic book story, but I still really love that film. I would understand if they just had like a typical, like, let's fight Magneto on Asteroid M sort of thing. I'd be so happy with that. We're doing this? Like, why? I don't understand the point of it. And it's just like, because Jean Grey is Dark Phoenix. And I think that's the problem that this franchise has always had with Jean Grey. It's never really wanted to understand her as a character. It's never wanted to make some statement about her. It's never wanted to make some statement about that character having these powers and how it feels uncontrollable, and like how these powers are out of control and she's not sure what to do with them, and not sure how she feels about them, and how it has changed her, and how she can accidentally kill someone. It doesn't really explore that very well at all. A lot of these actors put better performances into this thing than this film ever deserves. This is just like a broken kind of film. It's a better broken film. Like most are like truly train wreck movies, I'd say this is like the best. I'm sort of glad we're done with this, because I just don't like this way of making X-Men movies anymore. It was fine in 2003, and it was fine in 2000, and it was fine with First Class and Days of Future Past. But those were things that understood what they're doing and what the kind of comic book movie was right for that context. As soon as you lose that context with a comic book movie, especially in our modern day context, which is very much a thing and is very much something that gets talked about endlessly, so I'm a little surprised how you missed all this. This movie ignored that. And it's not that you need that context, it's that this film needed some sense of it. So if you have seen X-Men Dark Phoenix and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.